Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lesson in which we will be discussing the essential question, what makes a country? This may sound like a simple question, but by the time we get to the end of the lesson, I think you will all agree that this question is more complex than the average person thinks that it is. As you listen to today's lesson, I want you to think about the following questions. First of all, what makes a country a country? Might be worth pausing in class and having a conversation about that. What do you think a country is before we even dive into the lesson? Are there different kinds of countries? If you can think of different kinds of countries, perhaps that is a good topic for a classroom conversation. Are some countries more stable than others? If your answer is yes, then you'd want to talk about why that is. If your answer is no, it might be interesting to talk about why your answer is no. And of course, the most important question is often why. These are the things we'll contemplate as we take a deep dive into the concept of what makes a country a country. So let's talk about definitions in terms of how the international community looks at what a country is. These are some things that we need to think about. In an international context, a country is often referred to as a state, which is confusing because we live in the United States and the states of the United States are subdivisions or smaller political units of what we know as the United States. But in an international setting, a state is also called a country. So, this is a deceptively simple question. Let's just be clear, it is not simple. Let's look at the things countries can do. If you are a country, if you are a state in an international context, these are the things you have the power to do. You have defined and defensible borders. The international community accepts that your country has boundaries and that you have the ability to defend those boundaries with a military or a police force. You, as the government of a country, have the authority to act within the borders of your country and to enforce laws within the borders of your country. And the international community recognizes your government as having the legitimate authority to control the territory and enforce the laws. You, as a country, have the power to relate to other countries as equals. So in terms of foreign policy, the international community recognizes you as a country, as a recognized state, often by the United Nations, and you can send a foreign minister to other countries or send ambassadors to other countries, and they will grant you the authority to negotiate with other countries on your behalf. And finally, you get to determine who is a citizen of your country and what rights those citizens have. Now, that can vary from country to country, but a sovereign country, a sovereign state, has the ability to determine what the qualifications for citizenship are and what rights they do or don't give their people. And that definitely varies both in terms of the citizenship question and the rights question from country to country or from state to state. So now that we know what a country is, let's go ahead and look at different types of countries. We're going to do a deep dive. Stay with me. This gets interesting. What is a nation? Now, the first thing I want you to know is that a nation is not the same thing as a country. We refer to nations and countries kind of in the same way, but in terms of their actual definition, they are not, I repeat, not the same. First of all, the definition of a nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language. So there can be nations that are not countries, and there can be nations that are split between many countries. A large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language. So there are nations that don't have countries or states. For example, there's a large group of people in Asia called the Kurds. They are definitely a nation. They have a common descent, history, culture, and language, but they are divided between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And let's just say that's been problematic. Ask Winston Churchill. And there are some countries or states that have many nations. So, for example, the United Kingdom and many African countries have many nations within them. The United Kingdom has the Welsh, the Scottish, the English, and some Irish. And in the context of what we refer to as a nation, the Scottish, the Scots, are a nation. The English are a nation. The Welsh are a nation. But they exist in a larger country or state called the United Kingdom. So if you look at this chart here, it is a very helpful way to look at what the difference is between countries and nations. When you're referring to a country, you're referring to an area of land that is controlled by its own government. The nation refers more to the people that live there and whether they have common descent, history, culture, and language. Okay, so one refers to a political unit and one refers to the history of a given group of people. That's the key distinction. So now that we understand this, let's delve into the different types of countries that there are. The first type of country there is what we call a nation state. A state, a country that is based upon a nation. Remember, a nation is a large body of people sharing a common origin, history, culture, ethnicity, or language, but not every nation has a state. However, a nation state is a system where people with a common identity live inside a country or a state with firm borders and a single government. That's important to understand. So, a nation state is a country whose population shares a common identity. So it is a country, it is a political unit with defensible borders, and inside that unit with defensible borders is a group of people that shares a common identity. So, common identity includes language. Common identity includes history. Common identity includes religion. Common identity includes ethnic identity. And common identity includes historically homogeneous population. A homogeneous population means ethnically similar. You're going to look at the people of that country and they are all going to look similar because they have a similar history. The best examples of nation states would be Japan. Japan is probably the best example. Japan does not have a lot of immigration. Japan does not have a lot of people from other countries there. And Japan is very strict on who can or cannot be a Japanese citizen. Historically, Germany, Russia, and China are good examples as well. Germany is probably the least good of those examples. Russia and China would be very important examples as well. And in terms of the policies of the Chinese government, it is definitely geared towards maintaining the supremacy of Han Chinese nationhood. We can have a conversation about that if you like. What are some challenges for nation states? Immigration, especially when we look at Germany, immigration into Germany has caused challenges for the German government because the population of Germany is worried about being less German because the entire basis of their nation state is the German nation, people of Germanic ancestry. So that is a unique challenge. And maintaining the national identity is also important in these countries. Immigration is a challenge for them because the dilution of their language, history, religion, and homogeneous population literally threatens the basis of the state. So, now we're going to throw it to the next concept, which is, wait for it, what is a state nation? A state nation is a multicultural or even multinational state that manages to retain relatively strong levels of patriotism from its citizens. So a state nation is not based on a single group of people with a common language, history, ancestry, and culture. It is not. Quite the opposite. In a state nation, you will have people of multiple ethnic backgrounds. In a state nation, you will have people of many different religions or beliefs. In a state nation, you will have many languages. You may have a dominant language, but there are other languages present in significant numbers. So the very idea of nationhood in a state nation is dependent on allegiance to the flag and the values of the state, such as some countries which derive their identity from being socialist, or other countries like the United States that derive their identity as representing democracy and freedom. Okay? We, the United States, are a state nation. Canada is a state nation. United Kingdom is a state nation. And since we're talking about Africa, let's talk about South Africa as an example of a state nation. We pledge allegiance to the flag, and we talk about our history as something that binds us because people from the United States are from all over the place. And even those people from the United States who are basically white and English speaking, the diversity of ethnic backgrounds of those people is actually quite wide. There was a time in American history where the Irish were considered a foreign group. There was a time in American history where Italians were considered a foreign group. So even though they may have been white, they came with other languages, they came with the Catholic religion, and that made them stand out as distinct and different. Over time, they became absorbed into the American population, but it has taken multiple generations for many groups to get assimilated into American culture. And even though English is the dominant language in the United States, 1 in 10 people in the United States speak Spanish. That is a fairly large number. So what are the challenges for state nations? Basically, the challenge in a state nation is constantly working to maintain a common identity and purpose. So if new groups coming into the country don't identify with the country itself and want to be assimilated into the country while respecting the cultures they came from, but still recognizing we're here now, we're Americans, we want to be Americans, and the country of the United States is something we believe in. If we don't maintain that common identity and purpose, our state nationhood becomes threatened, or the state nationhood of any country that is a state nation becomes threatened. And when we're talking about Africa, which is what we are talking about, this is a very, very important concept. So, let's talk about a failed state, a failed country. This is also relevant when we talk about Africa. Just look at that map. A failed state is a state whose political or economic system has become so weak that the government is no longer in control. So if the government of a country loses control over all or a significant part of its territory, that is a failed state. What are the characteristics of a failed state? First, a failed state no longer controls all or a large part of its territory. It no longer has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It no longer has the ability to work on behalf of its people, and it no longer has the power to act or speak in international settings or organizations. Many countries in Africa, especially in the equatorial region, are at risk of becoming failed states. According to this map, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, definitely South Sudan, and Somalia are in that danger, and it shows the countries in yellow to be in crisis. Now, Somalia was a failed state. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And we've also discussed South Sudan in class. We haven't just done that for our health. South Sudan is facing an acute crisis and a challenge to whether or not it can even exist as a country. And if we're talking about failed states, some people have even suggested that Mexico has some characteristics of a failed state. The Mexican government does not control all of its territory. There are gangs that control parts of Mexico. It does not have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. There are paramilitary groups that have as much weaponry, if not more weaponry, than the police and the military in Mexico. And in some parts of the country, the government doesn't have the ability to work on behalf of its people because it has been replaced by criminal organizations. However, Mexico does have the power to act or speak in international settings and organizations. So arguably, the fourth one doesn't qualify, but there has been conversation around that. All right, so how is Somalia an example in class? The option will exist to play this video. We are not going to do that in the context of a YouTube video. We're going to move on. So in class, we will have this conversation. All right, so now let's move on to the larger question. How does this affect Africa? We're doing a deep dive in the study of Africa. So how do all of these ideas of countries and nations and nations and nation states, how does that affect Africa? Well, the first thing you need to know and understand is that most countries in Africa are unstable in some way. Another way of saying that is that very few African countries are stable. Any country you see in red is threatened in some way in Africa. And even the countries in yellow aren't in great shape. And honestly, these two in gray are in gray because they're so unstable, we don't even have data. So consider them red. Political instability. Most of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, and when we say sub-Saharan, we mean Africa south of the Sahara Desert, below the Sahara Desert, have inherited colonial boundaries. The boundaries of that country have not existed in history for a really long time. The boundaries of those countries exist because those are the areas that were taken over by a specific European power at a specific time. What that means is that in many cases, many competing tribes are located within the boundary of a single country. Remember, Africa has thousands of tribes and an enormous diversity of languages and religions. And historically, some of those tribes have gotten along with each other, and some of them have not. And some of them have gotten thrown into countries together when they really don't like each other. And some of them have been split in half by new national borders. Lots of challenges there. In other cases, which is what I just alluded to, you have a single tribe, also we could refer to the tribes as being nations, that may be split between multiple countries. So if you have a group of people like the Kurds in Asia that get split between multiple countries, they're going to spend a lot of their time trying to get those borders changed so that they can all live within a single country. That leads to instability. This makes a majority of African countries state nations as opposed to nation states. In most cases, the boundaries of these countries are determined by colonial boundaries, and so the governments basically have to get allegiance from their citizens with loyalty to the state. That is often centered around a common language, which is usually not a native language. In fact, it almost never is a native language It's the language of the colonizer, English, French, Portuguese. That makes things very interesting and very challenging. The colonial language is often the only glue that holds these countries together. And underneath that, you have lots of tribal tension and animosity and different small groups within the country working against each other instead of working together for the betterment of the entire country. This is extremely challenging, which means allegiance to the country is challenging. So, again, how does this affect Africa? Let's look through the lens of religion. In countries with large Christian and Muslim populations, political stability is challenging because there is no unifying belief system or faith. So look at this red area here. Any country that is transited by this red area is under strain in some way from religious tension between the Muslim world, which is mainly North and East Africa, and the Christian world, which is mainly West and South Africa. This band along the equator, again, notice a lot of these things are along the equator, is a band of multiple countries that are affected by religious strife. And with that, we may have some discussion about the Nigerian election, which just happens to be taking place this weekend. Equatorial Africa, as I said, is where most of these challenges exist. This can lead to civil war. If you cannot resolve issues at the ballot box, and many of these countries don't even have ballot boxes, then the only way to try and resolve these differences is through violence. And you get armed groups fighting it out for who's going to be the top dog. And when you have armed groups fighting it out for who's going to be the top dog, usually it's the regular people that suffer. So, in countries where one religion is more dominant and where the other is a minority, those in the minority faith often feel oppressed. So, if you have a dominant group, if the Christians are dominant in one country and the Muslims are a minority, many of those Muslims may band together and form militias to fight for their own rights as Muslims within that country. If Christians are a minority in a majority Muslim country, they may band together and form their own militia to fight for their rights as Christians within a largely Muslim nation. These are real issues, and they're all in what we will call the red zone of Africa. So, hopefully, after this, you have some sense of the difference between a nation-state and a state-nation. Most African countries are state nations with very few exceptions. I would say probably Ethiopia and Egypt would be exceptions to that. But other than that, the challenge African countries face is not only the fact that many of them are economically challenged and they're challenged in terms of resources and food, but despite all of that, they're also challenged with just creating a sense of identity amongst their citizens with the actual state, with the actual country itself, because all of these are basically baby countries. So there's a lot of things that affect Africa, and hopefully you now have a greater sense of what you need to understand just how challenging this is for African nation states. And with that, this is Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the Mr. Blumendahl Teaching Channel. We hope you've enjoyed the lesson.